from one of the anterior branches of the middle meningeal artery. And the supraorbital artery, arteria supraorbitalis, springs from the ophthalmic as that vessel is crossing over the optic nerve. It passes upward to the medial borders of the rectus superior and levator palpebrae, and meeting the supraorbital nerve accompanies it between the periostrum and levator palpebrae to the supraorbital foramen. Passing through this, it divides into a superficial and a deep branch, which supply the integument, the muscles, and the pericranium of the forehead. Anastomosing is the frontal branch of the superficial temporal, and the artery of the opposite side. This artery in the orbit supplies the rectus superior and the levator palpebrae, and sends a branch across the pulley to the obliquus superior to supply the parts of the medial palpebral commissure. At the supraorbital foramen, it frequently transmits a branch to the diploe. The ethmoidal arteries are two in number, posterior and anterior. The posterior ethmoidal artery, the smaller, passes through the posterior ethmoidal canal, supplies the posterior ethmoidal cells, and, entering the cranium, gives off a meningeal branch to the dura mater and nasal branches which descend into the nasal cavity through the apertures in the cribriform plate. Anastomosing is branches of the sphenopalatine. The anterior ethmoidal artery accompanies the nasociliary nerve through the anterior ethmoidal canal, supplies the anterior middle ethmoidal cells and frontal sinus, and, entering the cranium, gives off a meningeal branch to the dura mater and nasal branches. These latter descend into the nasal cavity through the slit by the side of the crista galli, and running along the groove on the inner surface of the nasal bone, supply branches to the lateral wall and septum of the nose, and the terminal branch which appears on the dorsum of the nose between the nasal bone and the lateral cartilage. The medial palpebral arteries, arteria palpebralis medialis, internal palpebral arteries, two in number, superior and inferior, arise from the ophthalmic, opposite the pulley of the obliquus superior. They leave the orbit to encircle the eyelids near their free margins, forming a superior and an inferior arch, which lie between the orbicularis oculi and the tarsi. The superior palpebral anastomosis at the lateral angle of the orbit is the zygomatic-orbital branch of the temporal artery, and with the upper two of the two lateral palpebral branches from the lacrimal artery. The inferior palpebral anastomosis at the lateral angle of the orbit, with the lower of the two lateral palpebral branches from the lacrimal, and with the transverse facial artery, and at the medial part of the lid with a branch from the angular artery. From this last anastomosis, a branch passes to the nasolacrimal duct, ramifying in its mucous membrane as far as the inferior meatus of the nasal cavity. The frontal artery, arteria frontalis, is one of the terminal branches of the ophthalmic, leaves the orbit at its medial angle with the supratrochlear nerve, and ascending to the forehead supplies the integument, muscles, and pericranium, anastomosing with the supraorbital artery and with the artery of the opposite side. The dorsal nasal artery, arteria dorsalis nasi, nasal artery. The other terminal branch of the ophthalmic emerges from the orbit above the medial palpebral ligament, and, after giving a tweak to the upper part of the lacrimal sac, divides into two branches, one of which crosses the root of the nose and anastomoses with the angular artery. The other runs along the dorsum of the nose, supplies its outer surface and anastomoses with the artery of the opposite side, and with the lateral nasal branch of the external artery. The central artery of the retina, arteria centralis retinae, is the first and one of the smallest branches of the ophthalmic artery. It runs for a short distance within the dural sheath of the optic nerve, but about 2.25 centimeter behind the eyeball. It pierces the nerve obliquely and runs forward in the center of its substance to the retina. Its mode of distribution will be described with the anatomy of the eye. The ciliary arteries, arteria ciliaris, are divisible into three groups: the long and short, posterior, and the anterior. The short posterior ciliary arteries, from 6 to 12 in number, arise from the ophthalmic or its branches. They pass forward around the optic nerve to the posterior part of the eyeball, pierce the sclera around the entrance of the nerve, and supply the choroid and ciliary processes. The long posterior ciliary arteries, two in number, pierce the posterior part of the sclera at some distance from the optic nerve and run forward, along either side of the eyeball, between the sclera and the choroid, to the ciliary muscle, where they divide into two branches. These form an anterior circle. the circulus arteriosus major, around the circumference of the iris, from which numerous converging branches run in the substance of the iris to its pupillary margin, where they form a second arterial circle, the circulus arteriosus minor. The anterior ciliary arteries are derived from the muscular branches. They run to the front of the eyeball in company with the tendons of the recti, form a vascular zone beneath the conjunctiva, and then pierce the sclera a short distance from the cornea and end in the circulus arteriosus major. The muscular branches, rami muscularis, two in number, superior and inferior, frequently spring from a common trunk. The superior, often wanting, supplies the levator palpebrae superioris, rectus superior, and obliquus superior. The inferior, more constantly present, passes forward between the optic nerve and the rectus inferior, and is distributed to the recti lateralis, medialis, and inferior, and the obliquus inferior. This vessel gives off most of the anterior ciliary arteries. Additional muscular branches are given off from the lacrimal and the supraorbital arteries, or form the trunk of the ophthalmic. 8. Anterior cerebral artery, arteria cerebri anterior, arises from the internal carotid at the medial extremity of the lateral cerebral fissure. It passes forward and medialward across the anterior perforated substance above the optic nerve to the commencement of the longitudinal fissure. Here it comes into close relationship with the opposite artery, to which it is connected by a short trunk, the anterior communicating artery. From this point the two vessels run side by side in the longitudinal fissure, curve around the gano of the corpus callosum, and turning backward, continue along the upper surface of the corpus callosum to its posterior part, where they end by anastomosing with the posterior cerebral arteries. Branches. In its course the anterior cerebral artery gives off the following branches: anterior medial ganglionic, anterior, posterior, inferior, and middle. The anterior medial ganglionic branches form a group of small arteries which arise at the commencement of the anterior cerebral artery. They pierce the anterior perforated substance and lamina terminalis, and supply the rostrum of the corpus callosum, the septum pellucidum, and the head of the caudate nucleus. The inferior branches, 2 or 3 in number, are distributed to the orbital surface of the frontal lobe, where they supply the olfactory lobe, gyrus rectus, and internal orbital gyrus. The anterior branches supply a part of the superior frontal gyrus, and send twigs over the edge of the hemisphere to the superior and middle frontal gyri, and upper part of the anterior central gyrus. The middle branches supply the corpus callosum, the cingulate gyrus, the medial surface of the superior frontal gyrus, and the upper part of the anterior central gyrus. The posterior branches supply the precuneus and adjacent lateral surface of the hemisphere. The anterior communicating artery, arteria communicans anterior, connects the 2 anterior cerebral arteries across the commencement of the longitudinal fissure. Sometimes this vessel is wanting, the 2 arteries joining together to form a single trunk which afterward divides, or it may be wholly or partially divided into 2. Its length averages about 4 millimeters, but varies greatly. It gives off some of the intermedial ganglionic vessels, but these are principally derived from the anterior cerebral. 9. The middle cerebral artery, arteria cerebri media, the largest branch of the internal carotid, runs at first lateralward in the lateral cerebral or sylvian fissure, and then backward and upward to the surface of the insula, where it divides into a number of branches which are distributed to the lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Branches. The branches of this vessel are anterolateral ganglionic, inferior lateral frontal, ascending parietal, parietotemporal, and temporal. The anterolateral ganglionic branches, a group of small arteries which arise at the commencement of the middle cerebral artery, are arranged in 2 sets. 1. The internal striate passes upward through the inner segments of the lentiform nucleus, and supplies it, the caudate nucleus, and the internal capsule. The other, the external striate, ascends through the outer segment of the lentiform nucleus and supplies the caudate nucleus and thalamus. One artery of this group is of larger size than the rest, and is of special importance, as being the artery in the brain most frequently ruptured. It has been termed by Charcot the artery of cerebral hemorrhage. It ascends between the lentiform nucleus and the external capsule, and ends in the caudate nucleus. The inferior lateral frontal supplies the inferior frontal gyrus, Broca's convolution,